Well, I don't know what he's done now.
I'm hearing two things here, I think, because I hear you say that remote work isn't necessary.
We can't hear you. We cannot hear you. Fix your microphone. When you get it fixed, you're going to have to start all over again. No, cannot hear anything. I don't know. They said it's the microphone.
did I get my friends excited about butterflies and moths when I came back to the United States? And yes, I tried. But I'd say it's a little bit harder because I think here in this country, we unfortunately don't have such a strong appreciation for insects. And over there, there's just a lot of kids that are interested in it. So I tried, and some of my friends got interested, but it was also the fall in New York. You know, I'd come back in September or August, and it's already getting colder. So you can go outside, but you know, Central Park. Oh, okay, excellent. It's a little bit harder to do so, but I tried. Okay, great. We're back on track, hopefully. So I was just showing that we were trying to figure out here in terms of what actually led to the ability to feed on these plants, these derived butterflies and moths. And what we found was really interesting. A postdoc of mine figured this out, but there were all these bacteria that existed back then, and we think that there was horizontal gene transfer. So the genes from these bacteria that are able to process, you know, plant matter and things like that, got incorporated into lepidopterans, and that's what led them to succeed in terms of being able to eat all these different kinds of plants, is what we think, at least now. Okay, so now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about moths. And I love moths. Moths are fascinating. And a lot of people don't think about moths because we actually don't see them very frequently because they're all flying at night. So the night sky is something that I'm really interested in. What's going on with these moths? Where are they going? What are they doing? So there's a lot of them out there. And the majority of butterflies and moths are actually moths. There's only about 20,000 species of butterflies and about 140,000 species of moths. So, you know, it's considerably larger number of moths than there are butterflies. But one thing that moths have to do is they have to encounter and deal with a major problem, which is predatory bats. So bats feed a lot on insects at night, at least insectivorous bats, and they catch these insects and they eat them, and moths are one of the primary prey. So how do these moths escape these predatory organisms? And the way this works, I'll just give you a little background information about how this works is, but bats produce sonar. Sometimes it's called echolocation. They produce sonar and it bounces off of an object like a flying insect. And then the returning sound wave comes back to the bat, and the bat can then process the location of the insect. And this happens at high frequency. So it's above 20 kilohertz or so. So we as human beings cannot hear it. So here we have a thermal video taken in Arizona, and that's a bat. So this is, sorry about the quality of this video, but there's a bat here, and this is a little moth, okay? And what you'll see is that this bat is gonna move towards the moth, and it's gonna try to, it's actually, sorry, here's the moth right there, it's falling from the sky. This bat is chasing this moth, and this video is about 10 seconds long. But throughout this video, this moth is able to escape this bat. And what's interesting is as this video continues, more and more bats come into the picture. But somehow this moth can survive. So how does it survive this extremely dangerous environment has been the question. And the answer to that is that more than 80,000 species of moths have hearing organs or ears. They can actually hear the sounds of bats. And that's how they escape them. And the main group of moths that this has been studied in is the tiger moth. And the tiger moth looks something like this. We can find them here in Gainesville too. Sometimes on your porch light, you might find a moth like this. If you look at the moth from the side, it looks like this. And right around here, in addition to the hearing organ or the ear, they actually have a structure called a sound producing organ or a timbal. So if we zoom into this area and we play this, this is kind of what it sounds like. So this is essentially how the moth moves buckles its thorax and produces the sound. This is slowed down, but it's like a zipper-like structure that moves back and forth. So why would you want to talk to a bat? Why do you want to make sounds at a bat? You're telling it where you are, essentially. But the answer has to do with the caterpillars. The caterpillars of these moths feed on toxic plants. So it's kind of like the monarch butterfly in some ways, right? But this is happening at night, so you can't use red colors to warn your predator. You use sound. So this is what I'm going to show you here is a toxic moth, and this is what we call acoustic aposematism, but it's essentially warning predators of their chemistry using sound. So here you're going to see a moth, and you're going to see a bat come up to it, and the bat is not going to take the moth because it is distasteful, and it knows that from a prior experience. So what's happening here is the bat comes up to the moth using its sonar, and then it hears the sound of the moth and realizes that's a really disgusting moth. I'm not going to eat it. And then it decides not to eat the moth. But what's really fascinating is that there's these toxic moths, these toxic tiger moths, and there are also these edible ones, and they both produce sonar or produce ultrasound. And this is really interesting because there's mimicry going on too. It's kind of like the Viceroy and the Monarch story, but in an acoustic world. And to me, this is so cool, and in some ways so much cooler than butterflies. I love butterflies, by the way, but I think moths are so interesting. Another group of moths that we've been studying is these hawk moths. Many of you may have seen them. Sometimes they're called hummingbird hawk moths or hummingbird moths. They come to flowers and they zip around and they fly away. But a lot of these hawk moths are actually nocturnal. They come to flowers at night, and this is happening at night when we don't actually see it. An interesting thing about these hawk moths is that they have ears too, but the ears are on the front of the head. So this is just looking straight at the head of the moth, and this is zoomed up in an SEM. But there's essentially, and this is something called a palp. There's two of them here, and this is the proboscis, or the drinking tongue. But inside this palp, there's an air sac, and the air sac vibrates when it senses the ultrasound in the air. And that's actually how they can hear the sound of bats. So we went on this expedition, and this is when I first started at the University of Florida. We went to the Amazon to look for these moths. We were really interested in hawk moths because at that point, there wasn't much information about how they actually hear and how they produce ultrasound. So we'd set up a light like this. Moths will come to the sheet. We collected the moths, and then we used a very rudimentary setup like this. So there's an ultrasonic speaker, an ultrasonic microphone, and we had IR lights and an IR camera. And we put the moth right here in this middle arena space. And my colleague and I, let's see, oops, this did not work. Well, what we did is we went to all these different sites, and we put the moth in that space, and we would measure if they produce ultrasound and when we played back a bat attack call. So the speaker that I showed you earlier plays a bat attack sound, and the moth responds to it, and we would record that information. And we were doing that over and over thousands of times, and what we found was that some hawk moths, like this one here, produces ultrasound. And this was not very well known until the time that we did this study, but we discovered that they actually use their genitalia to make the sound. It's crazy. So this is the male genital structures of these moths. So this is the very tip, and we're looking at it laterally. But some of these different species have these very bizarre modified scales. So these are scales. Typically, you think of butterfly moth scales as just being on the wings, but they're also on different parts of the bodies. And on these valves, these male claspers, they're really different in these species. And they stridulate the structure. So if you look at this moth and we zoom into this and we kind of look at it like this, these are the valves. So we're looking at the abdominal tip. We zoom in, looks like this. This is how they do it. Let's just slow it down a little bit. And so we knew that, we found out, okay, so hawk moths produce these sounds using their genitalia at the bats. So then what actually happens when it really encounters a bat? So we did an experiment where we put a hawk moth in the middle of the room and a bat in the corner there, and you'll see the bat come up to the hawk moth, and it doesn't catch it. It actually does what we called an airball. And if we slow this down considerably and look at what's happening, here's the moth, here's the bat, bat's coming up this way. There's a microphone up here. That's what's recording this. This is the sounds. So this is the sound of the bat hunting. And then right about here, we see this wall of noise that starts to happen. This is all moth. So the moth is making a lot of noise. And what's happening is essentially the moth is creating so much noise using its genitals that the bat can't figure out where it is. So if we simplify this, it's sort of like the bat produces ultrasound at the moth to find where it's located, but then the moth produces so much noise that the bat can't locate the exact location. And this is what we call jamming. So these moths can jam the sonar of the bats. So we've been doing this across the world in different countries, and we would bring students and study these moths and try to understand how they produce ultrasound. We usually use just forceps and hold them in front of a rig in which we record the sounds, just like this. And what we found is it's not just tiger moths, it's not just hawk moths, but there's lots of other different kinds of moths that are doing this kind of stuff. And to us, that's really, really interesting. And what we found is that moths have many different sound producing mechanisms, and they have them like structures on the thorax, on the different parts of their bodies and so forth, and they produce all kinds of different noises. And we also wanted to figure out, are these noises associated with chemistry, right? Do the bats actually, just like I talked to you before about with the moths that were displaying, telling bats that they're toxic, we wanted to know how the bats perceived each of these moths. So we would feed the moths to the bats to see what they do. And oftentimes bats love the moths, they just eat them, they're very happy. And this is what we're using a careful way to hold the bat in place so it's not hurting them. But sometimes we'd feed a moth to a bat and the bat absolutely does not like it. And it's very clear to us that this is not a very good tasting moth. And we would do this experiment. It's a very basic experiment, but it's very easy to figure out which ones are the toxic ones and which ones are not. So then we looked at this and said, okay, for the toxic ones and the non-toxic ones, what do their acoustic sounds look like? And what we found is that when you put this in a clustering method, they're unpalatable moths and palatable moths in these mimicry rings. So there are these distinct clusters of sounds that are very similar that are occupied by both toxic and non-toxic species, suggesting that there's mimicry going on. And there's even some that are we found a palatable moth mimicry ring. We think there's a species in here that's toxic that we still haven't found. But so essentially unrelated species converge to multiple acoustic mimicry rings, and there's all this Batesian and Mullerian acoustic mimicry ring stuff happening. It's so interesting. This is just 30 species in one location in Ecuador. This is something I want to study for, I think, the rest of my life, because it's so cool. And what's even more interesting, I'd say, is it's not just moths. So I had a student that was working on beetles a few years ago, and he discovered that, well, it was known that beetles produce ultrasound, but he really wanted to study this further. So he went to Arizona and he collected all these, they're called tiger beetles, but they're these beetles. And he tested the palatability, so whether they're edible. All of them are edible, pretty much. So this 100% means that they're completely consumed. So some of them were not completely consumed, but high 90s, so pretty much edible. And he measured the sounds of them, and he also created a PCA. And what was really interesting is that here we have the tiger beetle sounds in the red, and then this is the cluster of sounds that are produced by tiger moths, the toxic moths, and they overlap, suggesting that it's actually not just within moths, but it's actually within other orders of insects too. So these tiger beetles are benefiting from the tiger moths that are there. So I talked a little bit about sound production and ultrasound production, hearing organs and stuff. But what about these moths? These are big moths. You might know some of them, like Luna moths and Cecropia moths. These are called wild silk moths. They don't have ears. They have no sound production. They have no toxins, as far as we know, or for the most part, and they have no mouth parts. They actually do not feed as adults. So what is going on with these moths? How do they defend themselves against bats? So a few years ago, we went into the tropics, and one of these moths came to the sheet. It's a beautiful large moth called a moon moth. And one of my students said, why do these moths have these long tails? And I was like, I don't know. Like, let's look it up. On the very slow internet, we went online and we tried to find out. No information. So we said, okay, we need to look into this. So we started to think about butterflies first. Butterflies have tails, like swallowtail butterflies, these lycaenid butterflies, hair streaks have them. And they have these tails that look like this, and they create what's known as a false head. So here you can see there's an orange portion. That's what we think looks like an eye. There are these things that look like antennae and legs here. And all the lines on the wings point to that region. And the reason they have this is that it's for birds, right? Birds and other visual predators like lizards and stuff, they'll attack this portion. And they also move that part of the body, so it draws even more attention. The real head's over here. So the butterfly gets bitten in the back maybe, but then it flies away and it can survive. So that's the mechanism of survival for butterflies. But what about moths? Here's a Luna moth. This is one you can find here in Gainesville. Moths don't have these lines and all kinds of fancy things going on. So we thought, why do these things have tails? And so we started to fly these moths in a wind tunnel, and we started to watch them just to see how they actually flew. And what's interesting is that the moth tails kind of move up and down behind the body of the moth. But what's even more interesting is that when you turn it around and you look down at the abdomen of the moth, they spin like fans, like the tails go like this, like they go around in circles. So we thought, wow, this is really interesting. So how does a bat actually perceive this moth as it's flying? So we did these insonification experiments. This is a little complicated, so I won't go into this too much. But essentially, we had this high-speed ultrasonic array microphone set up, and we do this in the field where we put a moth on a little a stick, and then we would have the ability to rotate, and we would try to see how does this moth actually fly and how is it perceived. And from the camera, we can, this is how we see the moth as it flies. But the acoustic image, this is how a bat potentially sees it. So we wanted to really understand, how does a bat actually perceive how this moth flies? So imagine a moth like in this kind of orientation. And what we would do is we would fly the moth in that same orientation. So here's the FW stands for forewing, hindwing, and that's the tail. And the red regions indicate the areas that have the most echoes coming off of the insect. And what you notice is that the tail is actually quite important, right? There's a lot of red coming off of it. And that suggests that is very important, as it seems like it's deflecting the sonar and drawing attention to that part of the body. So it all comes back to behavior. We had to do a behavioral experiment to really test this. So we flew these moths with bats, and this is what happens. A lot of times, the bats try to catch the moth, but they catch the tail and they fly away. The bat comes up to the moth, and the moth survives. So what does this look like when you compare these moths that, so here we have moths that have tails ablated. So we actually removed the tails ahead of time, and then we presented to the bats. And then we also did a bunch that just kept the tails together. And there's a huge difference in terms of the success. So yes? Okay, there's a question that was asked, is if the tail of the moth is eaten by a bat, does the moth regrow the tail? The answer is moths cannot regrow the tail. They cannot. It's not like a lizard that can regrow a tail. These cannot. So once you lose a tail, it's gone. But they can survive at least one time, maybe even 2 strikes. And so the ones that have the tails were only eaten by bats about 30% of the time, whereas those that don't have tails anymore are pretty much eaten every time. So there's all these different kinds of tails of moths. And as a museum scientist, I went into the collections of the McGuire Center and looked at all of these things. I was super excited. And one of my postdocs now is looking at this even more. And what's amazing is that these tails have evolved like all over this group of moths. And when you start looking at these tails, they're all twisted. And that's what's so interesting. And the reason they're twisted, we found out, is they function as retroreflectors. Essentially, you can see like here, you can see these ribs here. The sonar gets captured in these little ribs, and they kind of get projected in different ways that fools the bats. And there's some that are more slender, some that are like twisted in one way, and there's all these clusters, just like what I showed before in terms of the clustering. So if you look at this tail, this portion of the tail of a Luna moth, it looks like this zoomed up. You can look at it even closer, and it looks like that. What's fascinating is if you look at the scales here, these are wide scales that look like this, but next to it, there are these very, very thin scales. So there's all this really interesting stuff going on here. And when you look at these scales up close, they have holes in them. So essentially, they absorb, a lot of them actually absorb the sonar, and while others are reflecting it. And it differs in terms of the different sides of the tails and so forth. So there's some really cool stuff happening. And I'll also say that there's been some really interesting research that's also been done in Europe now. And I showed this picture because a lot of people have thought that why are moths hairy? And a lot of people have thought that moths are hairy because of thermal regulation, temperature, right, to keep their bodies warm. But now this group in Europe has shown that it actually functions to absorb sonar. So it's like an invisibility cloak, like in Harry Potter. You essentially, the more hairy you are, the more likely you're not going to be seen by a bat predator. It's very interesting. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff happening. We're also interested in understanding whether moths can see bats while flying. We don't know at all, but we think they can. So we've doing a lot of this micro CT, like CT scanning and stuff of the eyes and trying to understand how moths perceive their surroundings. So why does it matter to study butterflies and moths? I've been talking about them, how excited I am and how I love their research and so forth. But why does it really matter? You know, it's maybe very niche, right? But the answer I'd say is that butterflies and moths are really important to the environment. And of course, we know them as important pollinators, right? We see butterflies coming to flowers. But as I mentioned before, there's hummingbird moths that come to flowers as well. There's a study that came out recently, a few years ago, that showed how important moths are to pollination. So here, there's a scientific paper, it's a little bit complex perhaps, but there's lots of species, these are all species of moths, and down here, these are species of bats, or sorry, species of plants. I've been saying bats too much. Species of plants, and all these lines indicate the different connections, the associations that the moths have in terms of nectaring and visiting. So this graph here shows the number of pollen and different kinds of pollen that they found on the moths. So they looked at, they caught these moths and they looked at how much pollen is on each one, and they associated the pollen with the plants that were there, and they discovered that there's a lot of interactions. Very, very interesting. So essentially what it's saying is that moths are very important for pollination and perhaps for plant survival. All kinds of birds, there's lots of birds rely on caterpillars. Lizards and things also do. Of course, there's the silk moth. This is a completely domesticated insect. It's one of the very few ones that no longer exists in the wild because we've relied on them so much for silk. Without this insect, we wouldn't have much of the clothing that we've had in the past. Sometimes the silk gets kind of all over the place, covers bicycles, and I mean, this is incredible. This car is completely covered in silk. So they create all these major outbreaks and things, and they are really, can be big pests. And as I mentioned before, lots of butterflies and moths are on this planet, and they are very important for the environment. But it's very important because recently, so this came out about 7 years ago now, but lots of insects are starting to disappear. And it's becoming pretty well known that this is happening. And this article is called the Insect Apocalypse this year, but it's talking about how all these insects are disappearing. Insects, we know they help humans at an annual value about $70 billion in the United States. Butterflies and moths are a fairly important component of this as pollinators. 40% of the world insect species may go extinct in a few decades. This is another proposal that somebody mentioned, another different group of scientists made this prediction. And butterflies and moths are the best studied group among the insects. So they are sort of the major group that has been studied for insects. So they're kind of the representatives. So this is a little bit old now, but what it's showing is that insects are still not really on the conservation radar as much still, unfortunately. So we have, this is the IUCN Red List. So these are species that are on the list of species that we think are of risk of extinction. But butterflies and moths and a lot of insects are still, many of them are not even on the picture. It's mainly because we don't know. But there's more and more evidence suggesting that lots of insects are disappearing. So this is kind of a very kind of sad photo, but I think it's a very important and telling one. So this was by Dan Jansen and Winnie Allwax. But what they showed is that this is a picture from 1984 in Guanacaste, Costa Rica. Same location, same lights, same general time, May 2019. You could just see the difference. And I've seen this myself. I remember when I was a kid growing up in Japan, I'd go back and set up a light in a similar way, and it's kind of like this. So this really is happening in many places. And what about butterflies? So that was moth information, but in the UK, 8% of resident species are extinct now. Since 1976, overall numbers have declined by almost 50%. In the Netherlands, 20% of species are now extinct. Since 1990, overall abundance has declined by about 50%. Butterfly distributions began decreasing between 1890 and 1940, when distributions declined by 80%. So butterflies in Europe are declining significantly. And this is not just Europe. We just have a lot of data for Europe, and that's why we know this information. But it's happening kind of all around the world. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Michoacan, Mexico, to see the monarch butterflies. If you haven't been there, you really should go there. This is an incredible, incredible experience. I just took this video on my phone, but pretty much all you can hear is the birds and the flapping wings of butterflies. If you haven't done this, please do this, because monarchs now are listed as an endangered species. You know, we don't know what's going to happen to this place. It's one of the most incredible things you can do, I think. But I highly recommend this. So places like this, what's going to happen to it? So one of the things that I'm doing now and trying to do as much as possible at the McGuire Center is to further this, to further the study and understanding of butterflies and moths. So the center was, and many of you probably know this, but it was founded in 2004. So it's our 20th anniversary this year. We have some pamphlets that are being handed out. So please take one when you leave. We think there are about 10 million specimens that are in the collection, but we don't actually know because there's so many of them. Tom Emmel was, many of you may know of him, but he was the founding director. He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. But we have one of the largest collections in the world here in Gainesville, Florida. It's incredible. And it's been put together in 20 years. And so this is one of our great strengths. And our mission at the center, as I just kind of briefly talked about, is to advance the understanding and conservation of the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and community-driven science focused on butterflies and moths. So we're trying to use these collections to really understand the butterflies and moths, what's happened in the past and what might happen in the future. We have a bunch of different staff members that are focused on different kinds of research. Our newest hire is Von Shirey, who just started last week. The research spans from conservation, evolution, genetics, behavior, and so forth. So one of the things that I just mentioned is that we're using the data to try to understand butterfly distributions. So we have this huge collection, and this collection is very helpful because it tells us when a butterfly was at a particular time in the past. And we can use this information to build models to predict what will happen with climate change and butterfly distributions, habitat change, so forth. And what we've done is we've found that many of the areas that need to be conserved are areas that are montane regions, for example. So this is just, it's pretty complex. I'm not going to go into the details, but what it's showing is that some of these blue and dark areas are places that need to be conserved. And obviously there's biases because of the way the data have been collected and so forth, but it's very important to help us inform what are the areas of conservation need. So we also have the butterfly wall of wings that you may have seen. There's a discovery zone for kids, and of course the butterfly rainforest, which is a great experience if you haven't been there. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to do more of this education for kids in terms of butterflies and moths. And I think this is really important. I think about my childhood in Japan and growing up in a place where insects are loved and really cherished. And I think we need to do the same thing because this is our future. The kids are the future of the planet, and we need to really educate them and make them understand how important nature is and how we need to survive alongside nature. So with that, I'd just like to thank the various different organizations and supporting groups that provided this work with me, and my lab, many of my former and present students who contributed to many of the aspects of this presentation. So without their help, this would not have been possible. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. It was really interesting. Questions?
I know that the museum is going to close in March for about a year, what happens to all the butterflies and moths that are there?
Yeah, great question. So the butterflies and moths that are at the museum, so the museum is closing in March, as you mentioned. It's going to be closed for about a year or so. We are not, the public side of the museum is going to be closed. So there will be no butterflies and moths that will be in that enclosure at that time. But once we reopen again, we are going to have a very new front area of the museum. There's going to be a lot of new renovations that are being done. So it's a very important thing that we're doing in terms of moving forward into the future. And the butterfly rainforest too will have new plaques and new things that are there for everybody. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I'm feeling very sorry for bats. I can't imagine how they get enough to eat with all those mechanisms. But my question is, the decline in moths and butterflies. I mean, I could speculate, but I'd rather hear you speculate on the causes of that.
Yes, this is a good question. So there's a lot of different drivers of the insect decline situation. A lot of it has to do with temperature change. We found that there've been these surveys that have been done in the middle of national parks where there's actually no disturbance in the sense of no buildings are built or trees being cut or anything like that. The only change that we know is occurring there is seemingly from temperature, and those species are disappearing there too. But locally speaking, we know that there's agricultural intense runoff and lots of pesticides and things like that contribute to things. Water quality is very important also for the aquatic insects. It's multifaceted and very complicated. I should add that it's not all completely down the drain in one way. It's some species are actually increasing. The species that can tolerate human disturbance are definitely doing better. We see that with lizards and squirrels in Gainesville, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon that's happening right now, but unfortunately a lot of them are disappearing.
Yes, could you do me a favor or do us a favor and expand on the explanation of the connection of the wings between the moth and the butterfly? I think there's a distinction between how the wings are connected in the moth as opposed to the wings in the butterfly.
Sure. So one way we can tell differences between moths and butterflies in general is their antennae. So the antennae of butterflies, it tends to be slender with a ball on the tip or hook, and moths are more plumose or just slender. The way they land also has to do with the wings. A lot of times the wings are flat on their bodies or flat against the wall, whereas the butterflies tend to be folded on top. The wing coupling mechanism is actually quite similar. So there actually isn't a big difference in the way the wings connect to each other between butterflies and moths. We've actually found, I didn't talk about this when I showed the evolutionary tree, but we now know that butterflies are just a lineage of moths. So I hate to say this to people because people get disappointed when I say butterflies are really just day-flying moths, but they actually are in terms of an evolutionary perspective. They're beautiful day-flying moths. Can I just add one more thing to your question? I forgot to mention that one driver of the decline, especially in terms of moths, is light pollution. And this is becoming more people are becoming aware of this, but I really do think it's a problem that we all have to kind of solve together. And oftentimes if you don't need to leave your light on outside, I try to encourage people to turn off your light, not only because it saves electricity, but also because you are harming the environment to some degree. So, and collectively, this is a collective problem, not just one person, but light pollution is definitely a big problem. Yes.
Yeah, I think toward the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that one thing that people, the ordinary person, which includes me, tends to think of moths as dull-colored, but we saw that certainly today that that's not at all true. And I don't think you said much else about color in your talk. And could you say a few things about the influence of color in either butterflies or moths on their evolution?
Yes,
please?
thank you. That's a great question. So It's a big question. There's so many things that I'd like to, but generally speaking, because moths tend to be nocturnal, and during the day they tend to want to be hidden, they tend to have brown dull colors, because when they're resting, they're resting on a tree bark or some place like that, or in the leaf litter. You don't want to be brightly colored, especially if you're not protected in some other way. So that's one of the main reasons, right? And butterflies, on the other hand, are active during the day for the most part, so that they use their colors mainly for attracting their mates, or various other. In monarchs, they're actually displaying to display their chemical defense, right? They're warning their predators like birds by being red or orange to tell them that they're chemically defended. But so it has to do with light, really. It has to do with the light environment, because you need to have light to display your color. Things that are not active during the day tend to be, like moths, tend to be brown, the ones that are active at night.
The evolution of the different behaviors of jamming and of thing. Do we have any idea how long ago this is? Are these recent evolution? Is this way past and they've always had it? Having done a little bit of help with bat research, they're not all starving to death. So, and I want to know, who are they eating? And my other question is, have the bats evolved a way to deal with the evolution in the moths and butterflies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, yeah, I should clarify that while these moths have these strategies against bats, it's not 100%, right? And a lot of times, like even with the tails that I showed, they have two tails. And if a bat bites one or both of them, and another bat bites the other one, then they don't really have a very good chance of survival, right? So it's sort of it's all about time. Can you get to your mate before you get eaten, kind of situation. Bats have also, this is an evolutionary arms race where these two groups are really going back and forth and improving their abilities. Something I didn't talk about either is the ability of these moths to use gravity. So oftentimes, if they're exhausted, at least this is what we think, but we've seen this happen, and we know it happens quite often, is that if they hear the sonar of the bat, if they don't have the ability to produce sound, what they'll do is they just close their wings and just fall to the ground. So they use gravity to get out of that space, of that bat sonar space, and they can get away that way. Other ones just fly faster, or they turn, or they have erratic flight and stuff like this. But bats have evolved all these amazing ways. Like that video that I showed initially, the bat captures the moth using its wings. There's others that use the tails, So, and it's just remarkable, and we're just starting to understand how all this works, and it's really incredible. And yeah, I don't know, like we have no idea how small. There's a lot of small moths. We're just studying the big things, but we think that they might have gotten actually really small to just spend time in the brush, right? If you're not exposed into these open areas, you don't have to worry about bats, but you do have to worry about things like spiders. So that's a whole nother problem that we don't really understand.
Thank you so much for your talk. I found it fascinating. I didn't know anything about any of this. A question I have is, I didn't hear anything about female and male mentioned. Is there anything you can say about that?
So there's actually, I have a slide in here, but if it's gone, it's okay. Well, I can tell you. So, so with the tails, we've done experiments, and I didn't get into this, but with the tails, there is a little bit of variation between females and males and females, but it's not significant enough. It doesn't seem to affect them. So, females don't choose males based on their tails presence or anything like that. So it's not like a sexual thing. With the stridulation, with the genital valve stridulation that I talked about in hawk moths, we thought it was all males. We wrote a paper, we submitted it for publication, and we said, all these males produce ultrasound using their genitals. This is so cool. Please accept our paper. It got accepted, but then one of the reviewers said, what about the females? You never looked at the females. You should probably say something about that. So on our last field trip, right after the paper was accepted at the proof stage, we tested this with a couple of females, and it turns out that the females also produce ultrasound. And we couldn't believe it because they don't actually have the valves. So these are claspers that hold the female during mating, and the females don't have it, but they can produce ultrasound. And they do it by rubbing these scales. It's very slight, but they do it. And so we had to modify the manuscript and say that actually females also do it. This will be a future focus of a future study. And we left it at that, but they did that. But they don't produce the volume. We don't know. So one thing that's interesting is that females don't fly as much as males do. And females fly at a time during the night when bats are not as active. So there's this very interesting thing, because when we think of the nighttime, we think of it all being just dark, but it's not, right? There's the moon, things are changing, flowers are blooming at certain times of the night, and males and females are also flying at different times. The males in most species seem to be flying when the bats are most active, and the females seem to be relatively dormant, but they go and feed on flowers and stuff in the middle of the night when bats are not as active. At least that's what it seems. Yeah, it sounds like it, yeah.
On the Zoom, it says, Neil asks, besides monarch butterflies, are there other butterflies that engage in multi-year, multi-generational migrations?
Yes, there are other species of butterflies that do so. Relatives of the monarch butterfly do that in different parts of the world, in Asia and also Africa. There's also painted ladies do migrations. There's some moths that do migrations as well. So it's not just monarch butterflies, but others do as well, but not as long or far distances in most cases.
Thank you. That was a great talk, and I learned a lot. Quick question. You started out by showing a picture of yourself and your sister. How do you engage kids, and what is the citizen component of your center? Maybe you can say a few words.
Sure, yeah. I mean, more and more, now I have kids too, and I feel more and more that it's really critical and important to do this. And I try to give talks to kids in schools and things like that as much as I can. I think as scientists, it's a kind of a necessity and a duty, I feel. The more kids you can talk to, the better, I think. And, I think about my past, and my father took me out to look for butterflies when I was a young kid. And, he didn't spend tons of time with me, but the little time that we did spend together was so valuable. And so as an educator, I feel like it doesn't have to be a lot of time. It could be 30 minutes, but 30 minutes taking a child out into the, forest or into a field with flowers and looking at insects and animals can potentially change their future, direction. So I think it's critically important, and I hope that, a lot of other scientists will do the same.
I'm wondering about McGuire. Who is he, they, and how, and are they still involved in the center?
Okay, yeah. So Bill McGuire and Nadine McGuire are contributors to the Florida Museum of Natural History. When Tom Emmel was alive, Dr. Bill McGuire donated a large sum of money to build this center, mainly to promote the education of butterflies and moths, and also the preservation of specimens, including his own collection. He actually has his own collection. He was a butterfly collector himself, an enthusiast, and that's what happened.
Okay, well, this has been, one more question? Okay, this will be the last.
Well, Akito, I think you should not end your presentation without making the ask. I mean, there are people who have very wealthy friends and can pull together large amounts of money that can be specified to do something specific and very wonderful. But what about maybe just the average Joe that walks through and is just so excited about this? Do you all have sort of like a pool where just random amounts of money goes into and whatever kind of use? In other words, how can just the average Joe get involved and help?
Yeah, so this is really great. I mean, we are trying to support the center as much as possible in whatever way we can. You know, a little bit of money makes a huge difference in supporting students and staff and the collections and science in general. So there is a mechanism to do that. Maria is here, and we have a system set up so that if you want to make a small contribution or a large one, we are always interested. So if there's anybody here that's interested in this kind of thing, Maria actually is right here who can help with this process. Even a very small amount helps a lot. Thank you. Yes, please join the museum, support the museum. Join NABA, yes, North American Butterfly Association.
All right, well, thank you very much. This was very, very interesting and appreciated enormously.